Good morning, everyone. What a lively welcome. You never get that in class when you say good morning to students, so thank you. I'm Ann Heiss, chairperson of the Department of History here at Kent State University. It's my distinct pleasure to welcome you all to the department's third annual homecoming event, undertaken this year in partnership with the May 4th Visitors Center. Our session, An American Tragedy, Kent State on the Page, is built around Brian VanDeMark's recent book, Kent State, An American Tragedy. Although we're glad for each and every one of you in the audience today, I'd like to extend a special welcome to all KSU alumni who made their way back to campus to join us for homecoming today, including panelist Tom Grace. So let's give a round of applause for our alumni. I would also like to extend my personal thanks to the department's special assistant, Melissa Hallison, who went above and beyond to put this event together. So can we give Melissa a round of applause? I won't embarrass her by asking her to stand. My colleague Kevin Adams, who was originally slated to moderate our session this morning, unfortunately is unable to join us today. So I'll be pinch hitting for him. I apologize in advance for anyone who came hoping to see Kevin. To give you a sense of how our session will play out, each of our panelists will take some time to engage with Brian's book. Then I'll pose two questions to the panelists that are designed to draw things together, and after that, we'll move to Q&A with the audience. I suspect that many of you are already familiar with our panelists. But for those who aren't, I'd like to briefly introduce all three of them to you now so that I don't have to interrupt the flow of things once they get going with their remarks. And they'll be speaking in the order in which I introduce them, which is also the order in which they've very graciously seated themselves on the stage. Brian VanDeMark grew up and attended college in Texas, went to graduate school in California, and now lives in Maryland. He teaches history at the United States Naval Academy, Annapolis, where he has been a member of the history faculty since 1990. The author of several books on American history, he co-authored Robert McNamara's #1 best-selling Vietnam memoir, In Retrospect, which became the basis for Errol Morris's Academy Award-winning documentary film, The Fog of War. His latest book is Kent State, An American Tragedy, published by W.W. Norton in August. Gregory Wilson is professor of history at the University of Akron, where he teaches courses in United States, Ohio, environmental, and public history. In both his teaching and his research, he has utilized oral history and community history. His published work includes Above the Shots, an oral history of the Kent State shootings with Craig Simpson, Ohio, a history of the Buckeye State with Kevin F. Kern, and Communities Left Behind, the Area Redevelopment Administration, 1945 to 1965. Thomas M. Grace, one of the 9 former students who survived wounds inflicted by the Ohio National Guard gunfire on May 4th, 1970, is a historian and adjunct professor at Erie Community College. He specializes in both the protest movements of the 1960s and the American Civil War. His published work includes Kent State, Death and Dissent in the Long 60s, and he is currently working on a manuscript titled Citizens and Soldiers of the Upper River Valley, Sectional Unionism in the 98th Ohio's Civil War. Tom continues to be an active contributor to the May 4th conversation, participating in student and university events, raising awareness of the shootings. So I'm now going to turn it over to our panelists for their remarks.
I want to thank everyone for being here today. My remarks are going to be brief because what's in the book is the most precise, the most detailed, the most comprehensive, and the most accurate version of what happened on May 4th and the tragedy that I can present to you. So any summary I offer verbally would be diminishing from this particular book. The remarks I do wish to make are a general nature, and they are drawing parallels between 1970 and today. I think people often ask me what's similar and what's different about the protests in 1970 against the Vietnam War and today over the war in Gaza. And one of the things that stands out to me the most is this. I think the current generation of college students, frankly, don't remember the risks and the pain of Vietnam-era protests like Kent State. And that's unfortunate because I think anyone who lived through that experience, has read about the tragedy, are made painfully aware of the human consequences that can result from a situation getting out of control and people are hurt irrevocably. I'm also struck by the fact that then and today, the reaction of the American public to student protests on campus reflects the deep cultural and political divisions that existed in American society then and now. And those reactions are a sort of Rorschach test that I think reveal more about the politics and cultural perspective of those who make the comments than the students themselves. My other general remarks are these. What are the primary lessons to be taken from what happened on May 4th of 1970? Here are some of the ones I consider particularly significant. The crucial importance of attempting to avoid extremes, both in protest behavior and in responses to them. It's imperative that force not be resorted to deal with student protests. It's asking for trouble, it's inviting a tragedy that occurred in 1970, and I dearly hope that people in positions of responsibility and authority today and the days ahead familiarize themselves with the consequences of applying force to deal with student protests. It's also imperative to me that people, these are truisms, they're cliches in a lot of ways, but that makes them no less true and no less powerful. To me, it's imperative that people try to understand the perspective of the other side on these divisive political and cultural issues. And also keep in mind that old saying, reasonable people can agree to disagree. If more people internalized that and acted that out in their behavior, I think we would be in a better place and the risk of another tragedy would be diminished.
I was expecting more. Okay. Thanks, Brian. You're welcome. I appreciate. Can you hear me okay with this? Is it okay? Thanks. Well, that's better. There we go. So yeah, I appreciate those comments, Brian. I know in the spring I was asked similar questions about the '60s protest movements and today as well. So I think the value, if we ever doubted the value of history, we certainly realize what it means today, right now. So I'm really excited to be here today to talk about Brian's book, to revisit May 4, and I want to thank Ann, the Department of History, Kevin, the museum as well. Alison's here somewhere. There she is. And everybody for coming. So I'm looking forward to some good discussion today. So on the book itself, if you haven't had a chance to read it, I do hope you do. I've got some elements, a lot of elements of praise, some concerns and questions here. But it adds, I think, a significant value to our understanding of May 4. So let me go through some of the things I came to just in my first kind of blush through the book. I'm sure I'll have more as I read it again, but going through it a couple of times now. So let me see if I can give you some main points. What I want to do is consider mainly the structure of the book, how it's put together, how it's arranged, the choices that were made in terms of how everything's arranged, because that was, to me, an interesting set of choices that you made, and we can talk about that. So first I want to say how much I appreciate the depth, the breadth of the voices that are included in the book. There are numerous voices of activists, guardsmen, bystanders, things that Craig and I did in our book, but you have taken it and expanded it in a significant and important way. So I really, really appreciated all of that, how much that was included in that. I also really, really appreciate and was in awe of the archival documentation that the book goes into. The number of archival documents, film, oral history, testimony, newspapers, you name it, all of the pieces of evidence that historians typically look for. The book really went to try to find almost as many of them as possible and include them. So I really appreciate the variety and the number of sources, which again adds a significant amount of depth and getting to that point of comprehensiveness, which is I think what the book is aiming to do, right, to try to be that. So I appreciate that. Another part of the book that I think is very powerful is the profiles that the book does. Including the 13 students, as well as the Ohio National Guard, bringing depth and humanity to all of those involved. I think you did a tremendous effort to do that, and I really appreciated that, and particularly I appreciated the efforts to look closely at the leadership of the Guard on that day, particularly the role of General Canterbury. You did quite a bit there. I also was really struck by the powerful emotions that come through the book as you read it. I think you really conveyed that quite well, particularly in what we might consider the fulcrum of the book, the middle, which is May 4, and the trials as well. I found that to be quite powerful, and including forensic details on what happens when someone is shot with an M1 rifle or a shotgun. I'll confess I was not sure if I wanted all of that in there or how I still feel about it, but I do understand the choice, I think, you made to include all of that, to really demonstrate what you just said about the consequences, right, of what can happen when you have protests and live ammunition. So having been to the archives and seen the photographs myself, I can attest to what you were doing in terms of explaining that to us in the verbal sense, right, through the text. So again, I found the book quite readable, powerful, useful, comprehensive in many ways, and I'm really applaud a lot of what you've done. So. But I want to raise a few questions, as we do in reviews, right, and criticism. So, but in the spirit of historians trying to wrestle with a controversial and very raw topic some 50-plus years later still. So, as you mentioned in your opening remarks, I'm glad you said that. The book is trying to present itself, as I understand it, as a middle ground, right, between Brian, what you say are two simplistic kind of general narratives we have about May 4, narratives that lack, and I'll use your words here if that's okay, lacked nuance, which are fantastic, lacked nuance, ignored ambiguity, complexity, unpredictability, confusion, chaos, and cruel pathos, as you say. One narrative, quote, depicted the shooting as lethal violence in the name of the state directed against those who sought to defy its writ. And then the second narrative you mentioned depicted the shooting as law enforcement giving troublemakers the comeuppance that they deserved. And I know when Craig and I were working our book, we felt the power of those narratives as well. And I'm kind of wondering, what is a middle ground between those two narratives? What does that look like exactly? And I'm not sure I know, but I want to go through a few other areas which, maybe we can talk more about that. Along those lines, what you mentioned to start, you have a quote in here as well, which I'm wondering maybe we can talk about more, which is that most Americans have not allowed themselves to understand the opposing viewpoint or to accept responsibility. So again, in the context of May 4, I'm kind of interested to hear what, maybe you can expand on that as well. So I guess my question as I'm thinking about is were were the shootings not the actions of the state against protesters that used lethal violence to silence them? Granted, we know some of the men certainly fired indiscriminately, but some did not. Either way, I guess the way I'm thinking about it is they responded to the situation with lethal force under the command of officers. So I guess I'm wondering, can we not have complex feelings, actions, chaos, and confusion, but also have a state action that used lethal force? So again, I'm wondering if a middle ground slides us towards absolving the guard of responsibility. So that's one of the questions I had in my head as I read this. On the second narrative about protesters getting their comeuppance, certainly that's not one I don't think that scholars use, but it's certainly out there, right? Mainly on the far right, then and now. But in terms of analysis as historians, I think, yes, we've got to acknowledge that view certainly there, and it's powerful and it shapes narratives. But again, does the middle ground then put responsibility on the students for getting shot? So again, as I read it, I'm kind of thinking about that. So again, I'm not sure I have an answer, but I thought maybe we could raise that as topics of discussion. So secondly, along kind of similar lines, the structure of the book begins with Matt McManus, Ohio National Guardsman, who granted you a very powerful interview. And he's been doing some interviews off and on. I think, Tom, you'll probably mention that a little bit in your remarks. But I was thinking about the choice of starting a book about Kent State with McManus, putting him in front, bringing us in with his perspective, his trauma, his psychological history that he's dealt with in the days and years since then. And then the book has a powerful middle with May 4, which I mentioned, but then it also ends with McManus and the Guard kind of taking us out. So I'm thinking about that choice, and in my mind, I'm wondering if it might have the danger of decentering the students and those that were killed and those that were wounded from the narrative, and instead shift us to think more about the Guard first. Again, questions, I'm not sure that's where the book was going, but I wondered that as I read it. So, and then another juxtaposition with that first one is that the book then goes into a very detailed discussion of the Weathermen, the radical, violent, right, more extreme elements of the New Left in the 1960s. So to me, going with McManus to the Weathermen sets the reader up to see the protesters as extreme, to see the Guard in a sympathetic light before we get to anything else about May 4. So as I was reading, I felt myself being pulled that way, as I went through the book. We learn later, in an aside in the book, that there were no Weathermen on Kent's campus on May 4, despite the fact that the authorities insisted that they were there and wanted to find them, and there were tons of rumors, right, about Weathermen and all of that, but they weren't there. So it was a curious choice to me to kind of start the book with a group that wasn't at May 4. So anyway, the phrase outside agitators, which we know is used today, was certainly used back then as well, and it kind of led me along those lines, thinking about the present and that phrase in our current climate. So, and then you had another provocative line, which again, these are things that struck me. Again, talking about SDS on Kent's campus and the actions that they took in protest, being loud, right, aggressive, all of those things. And I know, Tom, we were talking about this today, right, this morning. But you have this line in there that says, instead of police brutality, there was SDS brutality. And to me, that struck me as a very curious line, equating SDS, which was not engaged in anything like police brutality on campus, equating those two. So I'm not sure what was meant by that. If anything, I think the record shows that the right-wing students on Kent's campus certainly were engaged in a lot of violence against SDS and were never prosecuted or brought to justice for that. So including very quick, soon around May 4 there. And finally, I'll close with just a little bit about the use of testimony, interviews with the media, and of course oral history, as that's a big part of the book. And again, it's a very powerful part of the book. What I did want more of, I should say, was a little more care with some of the interviews that were done, particularly the oral history interviews. The book pushes to include as many voices and narrators as possible, and I think that's a strength of the book, to be inclusive. But I think in some ways that inclusivity sacrificed quality. In other words, quantity over quality. Care analysis, detailed discussion, nuance, parsing out what we know can happen when people give oral history interviews, especially over the course of many years, what memory can do, what it can't do, all of those things. It doesn't mean we don't use oral history, right? We do, I do. But it means as a source, we've got to take care with it just as we would any source as a historian, but particularly with oral history, in that way. So there were a couple of places where I thought maybe some care that I noticed, at least up front. And one we talked about already, which is the anonymous interview that was given to Sandra Halem in the collection here at Kent State. That interview is not, I would not call it reliable in a lot of ways, mainly in part because the narrator describes a series of large objects, debris, logs, many things being hit and thrown at the guard on Blanket Hill in those moments around the shootings, which again, the corroborating evidence, photography that we have doesn't really show that that's in fact what happened. And so when you know that about this narrator, it makes you begin to question and be very careful about what else this narrator wants to say. And again, I would say that about any narrator, right? I'm not, singling out this one, but that one in particular struck me because Craig and I, were trying to be very careful about how do you negotiate this? What someone says, what they think happened, what they believe may have happened, and what actually might have happened, or at least we suspect happened. So I think there's a quote in there from James Pierce as well along similar lines. And I won't go into the details yet. So again, with the oral history part of it, I think we know that we need to weigh it against other evidence, corroborate it as we do our jobs as historians. And I do think that when you put McManus in and give us that very powerful interview, you're trying to do that with a lot of the corroborating evidence, right, for what he tells you. And so I think there's an effort to really make that happen there in that section. So, again, I appreciated the depth there, trying to be very careful to balance out what he says and what the other evidence also suggests as well. So, remember, we all know we're narrators too, right? We're historians. We're telling stories, right? That's what we do. We go for evidence. It's maybe more in-depth and sophisticated than that, but nonetheless, it is a narrative. And so all narratives are about stories. We all are placing ourselves, or we place ourselves in an event. We shape our own roles. We shape history through our words, through our memories. We as scholars are also trying to shape history, right, through what we write and how we approach the subject as well. So in a case particularly like this with Kent, any event where there's violence and trauma and a emotional power and rawness that there still is here, I think we have to be careful about not being seduced by the desires of narrators, but I think we also have to be careful about not being seduced by our own desires to control the narrative in some way as well. So as I said, the book, valuable, comprehensive. I think it's going to make a tremendous contribution once it gets out there into the ether and everybody starts reading it. So thanks, Brian. I appreciate it.
Good morning. I sat in this lecture hall and the adjoining one many, many times as a student taking history and political science courses. This is the first time I've ever stood behind the lectern, which seems to date from the 1960s. So you'll forgive me for being unable to resist the urge here to use it. I might also point out in a less humorous vein that I was either in this lecture hall or the adjoining one that I was sitting on May 4th, 1970, first taking a history exam and then a political science class, and weighing the decision whether that I would walk back to my apartment or go over to the Commons where I knew a rally to be taking place. And many of you know about the decision that I made, but for some of you who didn't, or don't rather, I did go over to the rally, and it had rather fateful consequences for me and 12 other people. But with that said, I have some prepared remarks, and I'd ask for your patience. We were given 15 minutes. I think I'm able to keep it close to that. If I run over, I'll ask for your indulgence. But I think during the discussion period, we all want to hear from Dr. VanDeMark more about his book. And I'm glad that Dr. Greg Wilson went into so much of it in depth, because you have those of you who haven't read it. I've gifted it to several people already this morning. I know some of you have read the book. But for those of you that haven't, I certainly urge you to do so. This book deserves to be read and widely read. To Professor Ann Heiss, who's pinch hitting, as she said, and Director Alison Caplan, I extend my appreciation for inviting me to participate in this discussion of Brian VanDeMark's book about the Kent State shootings. For decades now, many, including my former roommate and late friend Alan Canfora, who was wounded right next to me on May 4th, 1970, called on the Ohio National Guardsmen responsible for the killings to tell what they knew. Owing to his outreach to guardsmen, Professor VanDeMark has taken evidence obtained from one of them, former Sergeant Matthew McManus, to construct a narrative that may or may not offer a truthful explanation of the deadly events that occurred here in 1970. While we assess this new evidence, however, let me say that Dr. VanDeMark has crafted one of the most exhaustive accounts of what some still call a massacre at Kent State and what he regards as a human catastrophe. W.W. Norton, which produced this well-executed book, publishes academic works, though it is not a university press. Had I been asked to evaluate the scholarly value of Kent State, an American tragedy, as I have with some other books about the shootings, I would have recommended publication while taking the opportunity to point out factual errors prior to its issuance. VanDeMark's book promises to be one of the most widely read studies about Kent State's worst day. Beyond the book's stunning account of one of the indicted guardsmen, the study is overall impressively researched and written. The author has utilized sources that were either not available to me, such as the Guardsmen's History Project at Ohio Northern University. I certainly recommend that everyone examine that. It's an indispensable piece of evidence. Or in the case of the collection in Columbus, some archival sources of which I had been unaware. So in this book, I feel that I really did my thorough research for my own book, but in Dr. VanDeMark's case, he found some sources that I had been unaware of. So simply put, he has more than done his homework. VanDeMark's work expands considerably on what we know about the killings. Excuse me one second, getting over a little bug here. He devotes over 100 pages to the deadly clash, providing a granular level of description. Many here will welcome this level of detail. The same community of readers should appreciate the mostly careful documentation and will agree with the critic who directed readers to the author's quote, unquote, copious footnotes. In his words, the critics that is, that are certainly worth poring over, end of quote. VanDeMark's explanations of still controversial and often confusing events are not always persuasive. Nevertheless, he contributes meaningfully to the existing scholarship. VanDeMark seeks a middle ground, as Dr. Wilson just pointed out in his study, referring to the killings as a tragedy, not a crime that many understand them to be. VanDeMark argues that subsequent to the fatal shootings, quote, both sides rushed to judgment, end of quote. This led a Publishers Weekly critic to object to the book's false balance. Others will find fault in the tone of the study. Yet for all of the many disputes it illuminates between the Guard and their apologists and those supporting the anti-war students, there are areas of consensus, and I want to talk about one of them. Few Guardsmen, for instance, appear to have respected General Robert Canterbury, who, despite being the highest-ranking officer present, always rejected acceptance of command responsibility. The Department of Justice cited Canterbury's decision to march his men down Taylor Hill to the practice football field as a, quote, extraordinarily poor military maneuver, end of quote. Two NCOs, that is non-commissioned officers, indicted for shooting specific students were more blunt about Canterbury. Larry Schaefer said of the general, if the general had had his head out of his ass, he never would have put us in that situation. McManus felt similarly, saying many years ago that the general was, quote, a blind fool. Canterbury's exodus from Ohio to Arkansas following his retirement may have signaled his desire to remove himself from the scene of his transgressions. The ghost of the long-dead Canterbury earns no rehabilitation in the pages of VanDeMark's book, who faults Canterbury, as he should, for his gross dereliction of duty, end of quote. In an examination of Sergeant Myron Pryor, those of you that know the photographs of the day will recognize him as the guardsman out front of all the other troops pointing his .45. A figure prominent in the photographs of guardsmen shooting into the students and who denied firing his handgun. Author and professor John O'Hara asked of his subject, quote, how would you like to go down in history as the man who started the killings at Kent State, end of quote. Now that Matthew McManus posits that he ordered and fired the opening round, the opening blast from his shotgun that triggered the fatal salvo on May 4th, the account appears as a long-suppressed admission of responsibility. Clearly, McManus has sought to tell part of this chronicle for a while. In addition to his interviews with VanDeMark, which are probably among the best we have, McManus has appeared in documentaries, talked at length to Hollywood screenwriter Jim Hart, and also talked or spoken with retired librarian Maggie Ruth, to whom he did not tell that he had fired the initial round. Over the years, McManus has wanted others to know of the difficulties that he faced in the years after the killings, including when he was indicted and sued in a civil litigation. Hearing of his acquittal in the 1975 civil damages trial, he was reduced to tears, saying that the years after the killings had been, for him, quote unquote, extremely hectic. Speaking more broadly of the guardsman's actions, McManus conceded that, quote, in the end, it was emotions that took command, end of quote. Paradoxically acquitting himself and others, McManus concluded then that the fatal shootings were, quote, a tragedy, but you have to enforce the will of the people. We did that. We protected lives. As the centerpiece of this well-captured account, with McManus's admission to firing the first blast, it might appear as though history now has the solution to an old mystery. But does it? On one hand, in the film Kent State, The Real Story by documentarian Scott Frayne, which McManus does not cite, but we talked earlier and I've brought this to his attention already, there may be additional supporting evidence for McManus's claims. But McManus's assertion is distinctly at odds with the forensic sound analysis commissioned by the Department of Justice in February 1974, in which a renowned firm examined the 13 seconds of gunfire. Among the weapons test-fired by the expert investigators was a Remington 12-gauge shotgun, the same firearm issued to McManus. This is part of their findings. We find that the first shot was not fired by a .45 caliber an M79 grenade launcher, or a shotgun. Quote, they wrote. Acoustic specialists further determined that, quote, the first shot is compatible with the muzzle blast of an M1 rifle. In scrutinizing the opening rounds of the 13-second salvo, approximately 4 to 5 seconds, the sound engineers concluded that there were no shots fired from a 12-gauge shotgun, the weapons carried by McManus and part-time policeman Leon Smith. VanDeMark tries to reckon with this discrepancy. He cites an April 19, 2012 letter from then Assistant Attorney General Thomas Perez to Alan Canfora. Alan had sought a Justice Department re-examination of an audio tape that he and others believe contained an order to fire. VanDeMark quotes the Perez letter as stating that the audio of the gunfire was, quote, unintelligible with no consensus, end of quote. What Perez addressed in that letter, however, was not the gunfire itself, but whether there had been, quote, an unlawful command to fire upon the students. Perez quotes the staff that re-examined the matter, this was in 2011 or 2012, finding, quote, the shouting to be unintelligible and that they reached no consensus on many words. That's what the letter says. In sum, the purpose of the decade-old Department of Justice letter was to refute Canfora's assertion of an audible order to fire, not to refute the 1974 findings on the types of weapons that were used to fire the initial rounds at Kent State. This raises the question as to why McManus would tell the author that he had done something that existing evidence shows that he likely did not do. There seems to be little doubt about his role in the killings, which included shooting the late Jim Russell with a nearly fatal blast of birdshot, has troubled the former sergeant for decades. And the author is much better positioned to assess McManus's mental state in 2020, which when the two interviews were conducted with him, than are others who have written about the bloody events. After all, I wrote a whole book on the Kent State activism and the shootings here, and I never spoke with him. But the author here did, not once, but twice, and thoroughly. But for 50 years, McManus has been, drip by drip, releasing the details of his involvement before this gushing confession. I share the same reservations that book reviewer Paul Branham wrote about McManus's admission. In Branham's words, quote, despite his desire to set the record straight out of respect for the dead and wounded and to save his conscience, his confession seems a bit too exculpatory. Remembering the details and timing of events that happened a half-century ago, even traumatic events, is notoriously difficult. This is one of the things that I think Professor Wilson was getting at. Considering the debate on whether other guardsmen, like Harry Jones, who may have given an order to fire, and or Sergeant Myron Pryor, who may have signaled one, it is probable that a final determination of what happened atop Taylor Hill will remain forever elusive. I therefore cannot share the author's unmitigated assertion that, quote, McManus's belated confession solved the central mystery of the shooting. Notwithstanding this doubt, VanDeMark's reconstruction of the May 4th killings is one of the more comprehensive treatments of the day that shook the country, and the book stands as a major accomplishment. My own handling of the deadly event, while extensive, covers fewer than 25 pages. VanDeMark's fast-paced account of the fatal seconds provides a remarkable sense of immediacy that is certain to take readers back to the horrific moment when history turned. As to other reservations with this work, I made a list of the factual errors, many of them minor, and have tracked passages that are puzzling, unsupported by evidence, or went underutilized. I also questioned the author's assertion that the killings brought 60s dissent to an end, as some others seem to believe. I'll address certain of my reservations and have placed others in an addendum to my remarks. To wit, in the second chapter, Stephen Ogilvie, whoever he may be, is incorrectly identified as the first president of the Students for Democratic Society. Then, in the very next sentence, Carl Oglesby, the former Kent State student, is correctly identified as the fifth president of the National Radical Organization. Of the several people who have contacted me about the book, One happens to be my first friend at Kent State, Larry Raines. We were roommates for summer orientation in the summer of 1968, whose oral history VanDeMark quotes a half a dozen times. While Raines was a full-time student from 68 to 72, he is mistakenly identified and quoted in one instance as being a member of the Ohio National Guard. Further, it came as news to me that the previously discussed General Canterbury was not a defendant in the 1975 civil damages trial. Maybe we can talk about this a little more extensively afterwards. If true, it is peculiar then that he was made to sign a statement of regret as part of the 1979 settlement of the court suit. The mayhem in downtown Kent on May 1st, 1970, was not, as stated in the book, the worst disturbance in the town's history. Up until May 4th, 1970, that day in history belonged to June 18th, 1936, when 6 people, an equal number of strikers and strike breakers, were shot in Kent during a bitter clash over a union ratification struggle that left the plant bullet-riddled and partially destroyed, and a van set ablaze. The bloody disturbance prompted the governor, who had once been the mayor of Kent, to send officers from the Ohio National Guard to the shaken town. Other things confused me. Is it possible that McManus used an alias in naming Charles Dotson as the troublesome soldier under his command and to whom he helpfully gave his gas mask? There is no such listing of that soldier in McManus's Company A. I'm using the Peter Davies book as my source, though there is a guardsman by that name who can be identified in the photo taken on the Commons after the killings. As to unreliable evidence, and this I'm going to spend a little time with because we really need to put this to rest because it's been out there for close to 55 years. As to unreliable evidence and unsubstantiated assertions, one interview that is particularly troubling is the accusation that students threw bodily waste at the troops on May 3rd, the day before the killings. That claim, among other allegations, comes from a sole anonymous guardsman. The nameless man was the first to be interviewed for the now voluminous oral history collection at Kent State, and also spoke with author James Michener for his 1971 book. He gives him the alias Carl Caldwell in the book. The almost certain falsehood has been reused ever since by writers and reviewers. The guardsman in question is known to have served in Captain James Ronald Snyder's Company C of the 145th Infantry, a unit with 2 exceptions that did not discharge their weapons. Further, Ed Grant, a sergeant in the same company, the only guardsman to write a book about the killings, made no mention in I Was There of this and other false claims. Moreover, Snyder, the company captain, was interviewed numerous times, as were the 2 enlisted men in his command who were involved in the shootings, and none of them mentioned the ill-supported charges. Moreover, the Justice Department interviewed 7 other men in the same company about Snyder's disproven claim that he found a gun on Jeff Miller's body. We don't know what the men were asked by the Department of Justice beyond questioning them about the alleged throwdown gun, but none of them mentioned the throwing of any feces or other sordid acts. In total, there was testimony from 11 other men in the same company, and none of them mentioned any such rank behavior by Kent State University students. Howard Means recycled the same uncorroborated accusations by this unidentified guardsman, which is the main reason that incoming freshmen at Kent State were not assigned the book 67 Shots. Dr. Greg Wilson, co-author of a similarly titled book that was mentioned during the introduction, Above the Shots, which I also commend to you all, handled the same oral history evidence with scholarly care. My final reservation raised herein is the underutilization, and Greg mentioned this as well, is the underutilization of extensive photographic evidence. Guardsman's account of the military ascent up Taylor or Blanket Hill, along with those of a conservative student, he was a student journalist at Ashland College, are full of descriptions of rocks, bottles, and bricks being thrown and of injuries to the troops. Certain students threw some rocks. In at least one instance, so did a guardsman. There are photos of this. In accounts of the actual shooting, triggerman and indicted guardsman James Pierce told of being knocked down by the force of one object. While difficult to impeach Pierce's testimony and that of other guardsmen, it bears mention that on a day when scores, perhaps hundreds of photos were taken by those looking for dramatic images, that none of this was captured on film. This is one of the objections voiced by photographer Howard Ruffner, who has, of course, his own book on Kent State, published by Kent State University Press, called Moments of Truth. And to the best of my knowledge, of the many allegations that were made about the injuries resulting from rock throwing on May 4th, no guardsmen were treated for them. I found the book's final chapter, Legacy, to be generally fair-minded and thorough. Where I would differ is the conclusion that the shootings caused many Kent State students to feel, quote unquote, hopeless about affecting change. In support of this assertion, VanDeMark quotes two KSU students, one a freshman in 1970, the other a graduating senior. Though I have no doubt that others shared this gloomy assessment, the fact remains that thousands of students on this campus continue to demonstrate against the conflict in Southeast Asia as long as the war raged. Hence, the belief that the shootings ended the 60s protest era becomes too tidy an explanation, especially when applied to the anti-war movement at Kent State. For those who might want an alternative interpretation to this, what I call death of the decade thesis, I direct listeners to the penultimate chapter of my own book entitled Carry On. Returning to my overall impression of the book, it belongs in every library about the 1960s and about 1960s anti-war dissent, and certainly here on the shelves of Kent State University. While I have a different understanding of some matters, I nevertheless congratulate the author on his achievement and for also setting aside the story of Terry Norman, whose role on May 4th has given rise to a veritable cottage industry of opinion. Like the late Arthur Krauss, his daughter Alison was killed here, for those who don't know, who dismissed the Norman controversy as a red herring, VanDeMark wisely puts little stock in the notion that Norman triggered the shootings. Whatever may be concluded about McManus's claims and Professor VanDeMark's acceptance of them, the study contains many good insights, makes effective use of many of the written sources, and, despite some missteps, on balance leaves me impressed with all the author has learned and now teaches us about a dark day in American history. Thank you.
To help us transition toward Q&A with the audience, I'd like to pose two general questions for each of our panelists to respond to briefly. And I suspect that Q&A will help to bring out many of these issues a little more fully. The first question is, since 1970, May 4th participants have often left multiple versions, even multiple official versions, of what happened that day. How do you handle that situation as scholars? Are the May 4th shootings a case where the boundaries between history and memory are particularly fuzzy? And the second question, much briefer than that, is where does research on May 4th, 1970 go from here?
All right, I'll start. I'm going to focus on the first of the two questions. I think any responsible historian needs to weigh all of the existing accounts and to the degree that it's possible to do so, corroborate those or disprove them. Professor Wilson and Professor Grace made several remarks that pertain to the book, and my general comment in response to that is, as I said at the beginning of my remarks, the most comprehensive, detailed, precise, and nuanced account of what happened before, during, and after May 4th is in this book. And I cannot do better verbally right now. But I ask all of you to read the book and come to your own conclusion based on having read the book. As far as human beings are concerned, I speak for myself as much as anyone else. Their memory can be flawed, they can be contradictory, they can hold back certain elements of the truth when it's too painful to disclose. memories can evolve and change over time. I mean, there are flaws and limitations in human beings, human behavior, and human accounts of what happened in the past. I don't think that those who are involved in May 4th are any different at all. But it's the historian's responsibility to weigh the existing evidence as carefully and thoroughly and responsibly as possible. And when it came to Matt McManus's order, what Tom didn't mention was that his order was to fire in the air a warning shot to prevent bloodshed. And in the chaos and confusion and beneath the gas masks that constrained their vision and their hearing, one or more of them either heard or reacted to the first word only. So what Matt McManus intended to do was precisely what did not happen. He meant to prevent bloodshed, and instead it precipitated it. And as the book mentions, both in the text and in the endnotes, there are more than a dozen witnesses and participants who corroborate the accuracy of what he finally told me. Should he have admitted the truth 54 years ago? Of course. Did he mislead investigators? Did he make misleading statements under oath? Yes. I'm not here to excuse it, to dismiss it. That's not my job as an historian. I'll allow others to judge that. But I do understand at some level the trauma and the burden that he carried for that long period of time. And I don't see how admitting that he issued an order to fire in the air that was misinterpreted is somehow exculpatory, as Tom used that adjective here. And if anything, he owned full and complete responsibility for what subsequently happened. And that, to me, is the exact opposite of exculpatory.
I was actually quoting another critic. It was in the National Review, I think.
Well, that may say something right there.
You should have led with that, Tom. You want me to?
Yes, please.
Okay. Yeah, thanks, Ann, for the question. Yeah, I mean, I think, doing oral history puts you right in the middle of that first question about history and memory, right? So, but history generally is always interacting with memory. And, there's a lot of scholarship that talks about this, conflating the two, right? Is history necessarily very different from memory, right? But I do think there are certainly areas of convergence, but also I do think that they are separate in important ways. So I think when we think about history being kind of official, in other words, right? One way to think about it. We're here as academics, we write books, you have museums, you have, monuments, whatever it might be. You have kind of something official that stands out, that the public expects to see as accurate or reasonably accurate, and can shape our understanding of events in those ways. Memory tends to be something a little more, although it can be collective, right? But it can also be personal. And often, if we look back at many, many events, there's a conflict between memory and history, right? What people remember, what they have in their own personal conscious, what groups remember, and then what official history might say. You see this particularly, I think, when you have kind of official state histories on particularly traumatic and violent events. I'm thinking of things like, the disappeared in Argentina or Chile or the Soviets in kind of recent history, where the state is propagating a history that denies memory, right? That pushes memory aside for its own purposes, for the state's purpose. So I think there are certainly many ways in which these two concepts, right, can come into conflict. And I think what we, as you mentioned, need to be very sensitive of is just that there are official histories being written by entities for particular purposes, and we've always got to have our healthy skepticism ready to go when we read these, when we see them, when we interrogate them on the landscape. Similarly with memory, right? We want to be careful as we listen and watch and read for those same ways. But I think we want to be sensitive to that interplay between the two. And again, for me, writing about Kent, it really comes forward quite a bit, as you've already seen today, and many of you are examples of this, right? Those interplays between history and memory, as these books are, and as we are here too. So, Tom, do you want to say anything about that first question? So, or do you need a rest? So.
Well,
Go ahead.
just ever so briefly.
Sure.
Those who have read my book know that it's a story of the activism at Kent State, and I tell the guard story only from what they told investigators and the court record. So I didn't interview any of them the way Professor VanDeMark did. And as I look around the room, I see there's probably at least half a dozen people who are present today that I did interview for the book. And there's at least 4 people here, including my friend Dean Kaler up front here, that were fired upon by the National Guard on May 4th. So we have a lot of that kind of testimony that I used in my own book. But when I interviewed people, what I tried to do was give them a scaffold, because I was interested in the kind of families that they came from. And I think more or less I trusted that they were telling me the history of their families accurately and truthfully. But when it came to their activism, I tried to provide them with a scaffold. So I wouldn't ask them open-ended questions. What do you remember about your involvement in, say, the Kent Committee on the War in Vietnam? I would give them specific situations and dates and places and who else was there, because those kind of things help provide a way of refreshing the individual's memory. And I felt that I was able to get a more accurate account of what they could recall as a result of providing them with what I would refer to as that kind of scaffolding. And I also always tried to compare what was being told to me with a written source, if that were available. Because when I did my Ph.D. at the State University of New York, I studied under, in fact, I wrote my dissertation under a man by the name of Michael Frisch, who was later the head of the Oral History Association in the United States. So I learned that, both the advantages of oral history, but also the dangers in its use, particularly when you're having anonymous sources that are being used, and whether there's no substantiation for the information that's being given by an anonymous source.
Yeah, one more thing, if I can, is that okay? No, I liked what you said quite a bit. I was just thinking again about, when we do interviews, right? And we've all done them. So when we do an interview, let me back up. Traditionally, historians, as you said, go to the archive, right? We go to find the text or the photograph, something that's already been created and is stored somewhere. And we go find it and we bring it out and we look at it and analyze it and try to make sense of it. And with oral history, though, what's unique about it and interesting and troubling, I guess, and fascinating is that you're actually creating the source yourself, right? When you do that interview, that source didn't exist until you do the interview. And then it's there. And you are part of that source, right? So when you're the historian, you kind of have these two worlds you're trying to navigate. One, I have created the source with my questions, with the setting we were there, what I said, what wasn't said, all those interactions, right? We've made that happen. We've created a narrative. We've created a memory. But historians are supposed to be objective, right, and not do that. So we're kind of in that muddy ground, right, as you say, when we do that type of work. So just to kind of add more complexity, right, to an already complex situation. But I will say too that we have to be very careful. Photographs can lie, right? Text can lie. Things are left out. So again, we just have to have that healthy historical skepticism, whatever source it is, right? And I think, you started us today with today, right? And thinking carefully, right, about what you see and what you hear, the old adage, right? So bring that healthy skepticism as historians do, to our daily lives, right, and what we're witnessing. And again, that's not always easy, right, given the amount of information that's out there. But I think to me, this is a good lesson in kind of how we sort of come to a subject and try to weigh what's there and try to make sense of it. So anyway, made me think of that. So. Do you want us to answer that second question about research?
If anybody has thoughts.
Future research, I think, was that
Oh.
the question? Sorry, I got stuck on that.
I'd have to think on that for a moment.
I'll just say a couple
Yeah,
of
go
things.
ahead.
I found the process of
Impressions.
writing this book challenging, rewarding, exhausting, wrenching, painful. It's a tough subject to wrestle with, and I don't see myself writing any further about it. I did the best I could in this book, and it's a tragic topic. So I'm going to leave that question to the two of you.
Yeah, I don't know. I was hoping Tom would help us with this, but
Well, I mean, I can.
go ahead.
I was excited when I heard that there was another book on Kent State coming out. I didn't understand what the purpose of it was until I understood that Matthew McManus had made this admission or offered this revelation. Then I fully understood why it was done. And I assume it had something to do, too, with the approach of the 50th anniversary. It may have, maybe you could comment on that before I,
Very quickly.
Okay.
How you got to it?
I was not quite 10 years old when this happened. I vividly remember the front pages of the newspapers. Even as a 9-year-old, I was shocked by what had happened. And that always remained in the back of my mind for the years and decades that followed. But as I got older and I became an historian,
speak more into it.
the unanswered fundamental questions were haunting. Was an order to fire given? If so, by whom and why? And I wanted to answer those questions if I could. And I knew that most of the scholarship and writing on this topic up through the fairly recent past had included the perspectives and recollections and impressions of almost everyone except the guardsmen, who have, generally speaking, refused to discuss this, I think, for a variety of reasons. Guilt, fear, legal jeopardy, trauma, and all of the above mixed together. I reached out to every guardsman that I could identify who had been on Blanket Hill that day when the shooting occurred. It's in the neighborhood of 60 to 70. Fewer than a dozen even answered my letter. And those who did were able to disclose things to me that helped me understand what happened in greater depth, more broadly, in 360 degrees. And to me, it just intensifies, reinforces, punctuates, and underlines the tragic nature of what happened. As I mentioned in the book, and it's in the endnotes as well, there are more than a dozen people who corroborate McManus's account. I didn't take it on faith or trust. The old saying, trust but verify. I think it's been thoroughly verified. But when you contemplate the implications of that, it's heartbreaking. Here is someone under immense pressure and stress, trying to do the right thing to prevent bloodshed, and instead it turned out to be the worst possible thing to do. What was intended to prevent bloodshed precipitated it. And it does bring some degree of closure, I believe, to those who are haunted by the unanswered questions. But in some respects, it also just deepens the pain of the tragic nature of what happened.
If I could have just one more thought on this to try to answer the question. I myself will not be doing anything more on this topic. My focus when I first came to Kent was the study of the American Civil War, and I've finally been able to get back to that over the last four or 5 years, and I'm happy to say that the manuscript is moving along rather nicely. But is Liz Campion here? Oh, okay, in the back. Thank you, Liz. For those of you that have never had the opportunity, and I know, Brian, you used it exhaustively, to visit the archives and specifically the May 4th collection, it's of staggering magnitude. And I don't know the direction that future studies and scholarship of Kent State will take, but there's certainly plenty of information there for scholars who want to tackle it in the future. And one of the most exciting collections, of course, is now being cataloged, and that belongs to Alan Canfora. Because I was with Liz when we brought the boxes out, and there were probably about 100 or so boxes of materials. So I have no idea how long that's going to take to catalog, but no one who writes about Kent State or the aftermath, particularly the gym struggle that occurred here in 1977, can afford to ignore this collection. But thanks to the book that we're here discussing this morning, we also know, at least I do, of other archives that I had overlooked when I was working on my own book. So as I said, Brian, you really did your homework here. And
I tried.
Yeah, and well, it shows. And everyone I've talked to about this book, I've remarked upon that. So to sum up, I don't know what direction, but there's a lot of material there for future scholars and writers to tackle. And I hope people do and further contribute to the existing scholarship on Kent State University and the shootings that occurred here. We're not too big on time.
Okay. I'd like to thank our panelists for their excellent presentations and for their kind responses to my questions. You've given us all a lot to think about. I'd like to move us to the last portion of our program, which is audience Q&A, which will be handled exclusively through the Asker technology outlined on the postcard you all received when you arrived this morning. Before I yield my place here on the stage to Alison Caplan, director of the May 4th Visitors Center, who will handle Q&A, I want to remind you all that books by all three of our panelists are available for signing and purchase just outside the room here, and that following the Q&A, we will have a reception in room 218, which is just up the short flight of stairs and a few doors down on the left. And also, just before our session started this morning, Mandy Monroe Stasek, the Dean of the College of Arts and Sciences, popped in and handed me a stack of tickets for tomorrow's football game. So if anyone would like to attend tomorrow's football game, the homecoming game against Eastern Michigan, please see me at the reception, and I will be happy to get you set up here. Thank you so much for joining us, and I yield the stage to Alison.
Good morning. Oprah Winfrey's book club, Eat Your Heart Out. This is pretty amazing. My name is Alison Caplan. I'm director of May 4 Visitor Center over in Taylor Hall. If you haven't gotten a chance to visit the center, we encourage you to explore the museum and the National Historic Landmark site during your visit to Kent today. At the center, you'll also encounter student interns that help keep the story of May 4 alive by leading tours for their peers and visitors. There's an opportunity to further connect with us by joining our mailing list via the QR code on the back of the postcard that you received today. And I know there were many people who reached out to me and said, I can't be here in person. Are you live streaming this event? This is also for them, and we will share it out on social media. But if you would like a recording of whatever snafu I'm going to make in the next few minutes, here's where you're going to get it. So subscribing to this will also allow you to receive the link I'm going to be moderating today's Q&A. Hopefully you had a chance to access the Asker technology. This is something new we're trying out, but it's used locally by lots of other organizations. There's a QR code on the front of your postcard that will allow you to share questions with today's panelists. This method will get us through as many questions as we can in our allotted time. If we don't address your particular question today, do not worry, as there is a reception that does include food. And book signing follow today's event, and Brian VanDeMark and our other panelists are happy to entertain those questions afterwards. So you will have a chance to personally connect. I know sometimes technology drives us crazy, and we want to hear your stories, because I know there are some amazing stories and experiences here. Including, I just want to note, there's so many people who are here with us, but one I want to point out is Don Grant. If you haven't had a chance to connect with Don Grant, he is here in the back of the room. He is an alum who was here on Kent's campus during May 4. He and some friends got in the car and drove to the White House, met with President Nixon. So when we talk about May 4 stories that have not been told yet, his is definitely one of them. And I believe he isn't here specifically for our event. Unfortunately, there are other activities happening on campus today. You might have heard about some of them. You probably do know about them. But we'll get to those later. And lastly, because of the tragic events that took place here on May 4, we have the unique opportunity to encourage civil discourse on campus with respect, empathy, and kindness, knowing the importance of peaceful dialogue. As we open up to questions and discussions, please remember words matter, and as we navigate this Q&A and reception and book signing of the portion, I think that's important as well. So I am going to open up my phone to questions, and there was one that came through that I was especially interested in because it related to the May 4 Visitor Center. So Mark Seaman asks, VanDeMark indicates that Jeff Miller was shot while he was throwing his last rock. Should the Visitor Center statement, quote, "No rocks were thrown at this time," be changed? Is that something you can address for us?
Well, the second part of your question is a judgment call that you as the director of the Visitor Center must make, not me. That account in the book is based on eyewitness testimony, but it doesn't justify being shot, let alone killed.
Is it the Eldon Fender? Yeah.
Do any of the other panelists want to address Mark's question?
We were just looking.
Okay.
We can come back. Go ahead.
I don't recall what the source for that. If it was the Eldon Fender interview, I thought that was wildly inaccurate, and it was also one that was one of the problems. I mean, it's a very rich source, and Greg and his colleague constructed it. Craig, in particular, who's now out in California, and they both used the rich testimony as the source for their book. But a lot of these interviews were conducted, 50 years later. My friend Larry Raines, for instance, whose testimony is quoted extensively in the book and accurately, to the best of my knowledge, what he gave the interviewer. But I remember being at a program with him once where he talked about the National Guard having machine guns. And I pulled him aside afterwards. I said, Larry, there were no machine guns here at Kent State. But that's how he honestly remembered it. But there weren't. So we really have to, and students very often too did not know the difference between an armored personnel carrier, like my friend Ken Johnson certainly knows very well from his service in Vietnam, and a tank. Right. There were armored personnel carriers here. There were no tanks. but students will talk about tanks being at Kent State. There were no tanks at Kent State.
That's in the movie too, Allison. I think it was it Peter?
It's Peter
Jedick? Yeah,
Jedick,
who
you're
says he
right.
saw the tanks. Anyways, so again, your decision, right, on how you want to handle the museum. So, but yeah.
One of the other questions I think that came up on this autumn, one of our students and one of the task force members asked, and Brian, you talked about your experience and what age you were on May 4. I wonder if you can she's asking if you can tell us more, what inspired this book? Why do we need another May 4 book?
Well, I can't be certain that any book I've written is needed. The older I get, the more frank I become. As I said before, it's a shocking event. It's a traumatic event. It's an historic event. And in my opinion, the fundamental questions had gone unanswered. And I wanted to try to answer them, and I think I got the answer, and the answer in some ways is even more painful.
So another question that came up, and I'm trying to find it here, but I'm interested if you could all address this. You're all coming from different places as historians. One of you was here on campus and experienced the tragic events of May 4. One of you is a historian based in Ohio that has, taught Ohio history, and one of you comes as a historian who is an outsider to this subject. Can you address how you approach it and how what perspective that gives you?
I try to be as open-minded, as comprehensive, as accurate, as fair, as balanced, as sensitive, as thoughtful as I could be. I think that's every historian's responsibility. The degree to which that is executed well varies by individual, and you can judge for yourself to the degree to which I succeeded at those things. But I promise you, I'm certain of this, I gave it my best effort.
Yeah, I can remember exactly how it happened. This is my memory, right? Am I accurate or not? We'll see. Anyway, but I came to Akron to teach, and I was tasked with teaching Ohio history, modern U.S., as Ann said earlier. And my first book was on liberalism in the 1960s. So I knew of Kent, right? I didn't study it. I wasn't an expert in it. Knew what happened or had a general sense. So in the middle of teaching Ohio history and teaching courses over at Akron, Craig Simpson, who we mentioned before, who was here at the oral history program at Kent, he's now in, I think, San Jose State. He had contacted me because he had been working on what became Above the Shots, and wanted to cooperate and collaborate with me to kind of help shape the book and bring a historian's perspective right into an archivist's world, which is where he was coming from. So I remember him coming into my office and sitting down with me, because it wasn't probably, I don't know, maybe a few months or weeks earlier, I had just been telling my students, we really need another book about Kent State. I didn't think it would be me, but I guess it was. So it's one of those serendipitous moments, when we're teaching, and you're just getting someone. I'd never met Craig. He just kind of showed up, or he sent me an email. But anyway, so it was very serendipitous is how I got involved in it. But again, like you, Brian, as I got involved in it and I studied it and I began to see the complexity, the questions, the power, the emotion with it still impacts me. Every time I think about it, and especially when I come on campus. I was just here, speaking of students, was it last week, Allison, right?
Yeah.
I visited the center with a group of students I'm teaching now, graduate students, and I do public history, so I wanted to bring them in to see how the May 4 Center works, how it operates, how they construct the narrative, all those things. And again, it just, when you come in, the power just hits you, and it continues to do that for me, as a historian, but also just as a human being, and understanding, as you mentioned as well, the emotions that are still there, right, all these years later. So, so that's kind of my part in that. So,
I suppose in many respects, my own path to this book would seem to be perfectly obvious. But at the same time, I
for the Civil War.
yeah, well, that's a good segue, actually. I'm at the Organization of American Historians Conference in 1990, just after having completed my MA, and I stopped at the University of Massachusetts Press. Some people already know this story. Book table to purchase the Stephen Oates biography of John Brown, who's, many of you know, lived in Hudson, Kent, then called Franklin Mills, and Akron. And I meet Clark Dugan, who was from Cleveland, and he attended Kenyon College. We start talking about Terry Robbins, who had been there. So one thing led to another, and 45 minutes later, I'm ready to move on to another table, and I hadn't mentioned to Clark anything about my background other than the fact that I'd been a student at Kent. So I decided, I may never see him again, so maybe I shouldn't withhold this information, and I told him what happened to me on May 4th, and he about fell off his chair, and well, what have you written about it? And I said, well, it's not my subject area, So 5 years later, he finally convinced me to turn my attention away from the anti-slavery movement in the Mohawk Valley of upstate New York, which was my original dissertation topic, and instead to do a dissertation on the beginnings of the student movement here. It's over in the library. It covers the period from 58 to 64. But of course, then to publish a dissertation, you have to write about the shootings. I was mostly interested in how everything got started here. But I did have to expand it, of course, to include the shootings and the aftermath. And learning about the extensive National Guard files that are at Yale University in the Sterling Library, an archive that Dr. VanDeMark also made extensive use of, more extensive than me. I was able to tell the National Guard story as well. So that's how I came to it. It was not as direct a path as might otherwise seem, but my lifelong interest really has been the American Civil War. That's what I came to study here. And as some of you know, John Hubble was not only a professor in the history department, but he also was the editor of Civil War history, and later went on to become the head of the press here. And happily, he's suffered some health problems in recent years, but he and his wife still live in Kent, and I try to visit him whenever the opportunity provides itself. He's been a tremendous mentor and scholar that I've learned from. And I might add that he was one of the faculty marshals that has been honored here along with Jerry Lewis year after year. And he was one of the faculty members who signed, I think it was the 23 members of the faculty that signed a statement urging President White to use the powers of his office to get the National Guard off the campus. In fairness to White, I'm not sure how much influence he had on the matter at that time, but that's what the thrust of the statement was by the professors. So, Alison?
Well, I was worried that y'all wouldn't know how to use the technology, and my phone is exploding over here. So, thank you.
I don't know how to use the technology.
I love it.
And I love the notes in here. So Matthew Phillips, one of Ann's former students, asks, conversations such as these keep past events part of the present. To what degree does memory of this tragedy impact present-day activism against state violence, including against citizens of color?
Yeah, you wrote that nice article about it in the Post.
I think the most important point I want to get across to everyone is that today's generation of college students, the Vietnam War occurred a long time ago. It's not lived memory. And one of the fears I have is that they're unaware of the risks and costly consequences of student protests. And to some degree, that's a function of choices and activities beyond their control. A lot has to do with how authorities respond to them. And as I mentioned at the very beginning of this discussion, force is not the thoughtful, wise, appropriate response to student protests. It's provocative, it tends to raise the emotional temperature, heats up the confrontation, and it increases the likelihood of violence and tragedy. I don't want to turn this into a debate about contemporary politics, but candidate Trump and his team have floated the idea of utilizing the National Guard without state governors' consent to deal with student protests. And my first reaction to that was, my God, do they remember Kent State? And I wrote an article to that effect. Restraint and thoughtfulness on all sides is indispensable, not only on the part of authorities, but on the part of the students. We have a constitutional right to free speech and public assembly and dissent, which is precious, but that right ought to be exercised responsibly, thoughtfully, maturely, and with restraint as well.
I don't know.
No, that's good.
Can we address the issue of students of color in particular,
Oh.
as it's a really critical issue, one that I would argue is also largely neglected in the book?
I repeat in the book an anecdote that was published in James Missioner's account of Kent State that had to do with why there were few, if any, African-American students on campus on May 4th. And I'll tell a quick story. One of the leaders of the student organization of African-American students went to a professor who was in his office, an African-American professor, preparing to hold office hours with students on the morning of May 4th. The student walked in and said, "Professor, you need to get off campus." And the professor said, "Why?" He said, "Because there are National Guardsmen out there with rifles." And he said, "You need to get off campus." And the professor kept saying, "There's really no need. I have students to meet with." And he said, "Look, Professor, you're a very smart man, but I'm from Newark, New Jersey. I know guardsmen with rifles, so to speak, are putting African Americans in profound jeopardy. Get your ass off campus." He left.
So I want to get to at least one or two more questions here. Karen Cunningham, who is one of the May 4 instructors for the May 4 course on campus, as well as Kabir, mentions this. Several guardsmen had already turned and were pointing their weapons before McManus acted, suggested that many have planned to fire anyway. Were any of those guardsmen among those that you interviewed?
None of the guardsmen who fired toward the students talked to me. McManus fired in the air, and his birdshot ricocheted off a tree downhill, and 2 pellets hit Jim Russell. Am I disappointed that none of the guardsmen who pointed their rifles at students talked to me? Of course. Am I surprised that they didn't? I am not. But back to the first part of that question, the fact that some of the guardsmen who had crested Blanket Hill and turned and pivoted and pointed their rifles down toward the students is what led McManus to do what he did. He saw the rifles coming down. And I think it was his fear that they were going to be fired at the students, which prompted him in the moment to make the judgment call of pointing his shotgun up and shouting, "Fire in the air." It was very loud. It's hard to hear through those gas masks. They're scared. They were outnumbered 30-1. It's not excusing what happened, but McManus understood how extraordinarily dangerous even pointing those rifles was, and he tried to prevent something bad from happening, and something bad instead happened. I don't know for sure who it was who pulled the trigger first, pointing at the students. We'll probably never know unless the person who did so is willing to come forward and admit it, and human nature being what it is, I doubt that will happen.
Right, and some of those men have passed on too.
Yeah. I think it's likely that in that noise and confusion and fear and chaos, that 1 or 2 of them heard or listened to the first word only. and in their mind, they're angry, they're upset, they're afraid. As McManus himself put it, emotions took command.
Brian, there's another question on here about sort of binaries in your book and thinking about neutrality. This person's asking, is there something of a false binary to focus on extremes of protesters and the state? What about the extreme wars which precipitate the protests? Not just an American tragedy, but global tragedy.
That's an interesting question. It's a relevant one. I personally think that the Vietnam War was monumental folly. But that having been said, I think Greg pointed this out, and Tom to some degree. I do focus quite a bit on the Weathermen. The reason for that is they scared the American people, and it created a fear, an imaginary fear in the town of Kent that contributed centrally to the decision to deploy the National Guard to Kent and on the Kent State campus. SDS, again, I could flip through the book to the particular page, but two incidents come vividly to my mind. In 1969, in the spring of 1969, there were a series of protests and confrontations on campus at the Music and Speech Building. And there are multiple eyewitness accounts of SDS physically forcing their way through doors and effectively applying muscle, if not violence, to have their way. There's also an incident, I think it was in the fall of 1969 or early spring of 1970, maybe in 68 because of an election year, where a group of SDS students interrupted a political science class held in an auditorium like this, carrying a casket.
It was this lecture hall.
Okay.
I was there.
You were there. Yeah. Okay.
I was as a student. I was not carrying the casket.
Okay.
In fact, I was bewildered by it. I write about it in the book.
They disrupted the class, and there was a sign on the side of the casket, and this is a quote: "Elections are crap."
The people lose every time.
I may be old-fashioned and I may be naive, but to me, elections are most certainly not crap. The alternative to that is exactly what we have to fear and ought to strive to avoid.
Yeah. I mentioned to Brian when we were talking beforehand that one of the reasons I was bewildered by it is that I was working in the Humphrey campaign. So.
So we have one more question. I think it's the perfect question to wrap this up, but like the line between the past and the present there, thinking about students and elections and what our students are saying and thinking about just surfaced for me. But the final question, thank you to the audience member who asked this question. Basically, what would Ellen Canfora do? What would Ellen Canfora think of this book? That's
I think Tom should
ending
take
to
that
me.
question.
And I think Tom needs to address it.
It's all you, buddy. What do you think? I don't know.
It's hard for me to say. As much as I know about the subject, Alan knew far more, and his recall was he was like a kiosk. You know, you just go up and press him, and he gives you 2 hours. You know, and I've seen him do it, and have the entire audience stay for a 2-hour talk. He knew all the testimony. He could recite it backwards and forwards. He was a person that weighed evidence carefully, and I think he would have looked at all of the massive research that was undertaken for this book. I can't predict what he would have said about it, but I will, perhaps the best way of answering it is many people believed that Myron Pryor discharged his .45 automatic, and that triggered the shootings, that he was the one. And I cited a scholarly article that appeared in a journal called The 60s that I actually reviewed prior to publication. But But Alan knew that that belief and some of the photographic evidence that suggests that Pryor discharged his .45 automatic was at odds with the forensic study that was done by B&N in February of 1974. So Alan was always very careful about stating what the photographs appeared to show and how that conflicted with the forensic evidence. So, and then there's additional information, just, I don't want to get too deep in the weeds on this Myron Pryor matter, but there's also circumstantial evidence that he switched up the handgun at the armory. So, but whether he did or didn't, or if he ever fired the handgun or not, it doesn't appear that he fired one of the first rounds. At least if you center your account of that day on the forensic evidence that showed what weapons fired the first rounds. And there's competing evidence here. You know, there's a very powerful evidence in this book. And there's other evidence as well. There's evidence that I cited that Dr. VanDeMark is going to look at that further substantiates what he finds in this book, this film that we showed here several years ago. President Dyken, I believe you were present for that showing. Kent State, the real story. So that's why I said I'm not satisfied that we'll ever fully know what took place. But this is certainly, I didn't use these words, but I would say that this book that we're discussing here today makes a compelling case for what happened, but not a conclusive one. Okay? That's my own take on it.
So with that, I want to thank Tom Grace, Greg Wilson, Brian VanDeMark, Ann Heiss for joining us for this discussion today. I want to thank the audience. For any questions we didn't get to, please join us for the reception and book signing. You can purchase a book from Kent State University Bookstore, who has joined us today, and we will be down the hall for the reception. So thank you so much for attending, and we hope you can keep the conversation going.